Okay, welcome everyone. This is a briefing for the Concordia growth area. I'd like to welcome Clint Watchman, Paul Bennett and David Reynolds. And you guys are from Plus, is that right? Or where are you from? I don't even know where you're from. I haven't been told. Where are you from? I can't hear you. Oh, trade and investment. Okay, thank you. Which includes Plus, yes. Thank you. So I'd like to welcome everyone here this evening. Firstly, I'd like to acknowledge that we're meeting on Kaurna land this evening. It's always a privilege to be able to acknowledge that we're meeting on Aboriginal land. We live, work and play on Kaurna land. If this is a briefing session from those gentlemen I just mentioned, thank you for coming along and briefing us tonight on the Concordia growth area. If people could turn their phones to silent, if you need to take a phone call, please take it outside. And I think it's being live streamed tonight. I can't see where it is. Yes, I'm being told that it is. So if anyone's watching online, welcome as well. I'd like to welcome elected members here this evening. We have an apology from Ethan White. He's not well, so we wish him a speedy recovery from his illness. I'd like to welcome Brendan from the Bunyip here this evening, and also staff, leadership team and our CEO. We have a few people in the audience. As I said, if you can turn your phones to silent, please. If you need to take a phone call, please take it outside. So without further ado, I will ask whoever's going to kick off this presentation, and that would be David. Paul, because I don't even know where David is. David's at the back. David's at the back and Clint is there. Okay, so Paul Bennett is going to kick us off. So if you can take it away, Paul. Just turn it on. There you go.
Yeah, you can hear me. Thank you.
Yes.
First of all, good evening, everyone. Mayor, elected members, thank you for having us here this evening to obviously talk about Concordia. Just a quick introduction. So we have David Reynolds, who's the Chief Executive of the Department for Trade and Investment here with us, sitting on the end. Clint Watchman, who's one of our project managers in the group here with in the infrastructure group. And I'm Paul Bennett, who's Acting Director of formerly it's the Housing, Infrastructure Planning and Development Unit. I'll get to what that is shortly. So obviously you all know why we're here to talk about Concordia, and I'm sure it's not a new project or thing to everyone who's in this room. So we may cover some ground that you may already be aware of, but I think it's important to sort of go on a bit of the journey, dare I say it, to talk a bit about where it's come from, what we've done, and so you know that where we're at and what we're intending to do as part of the project that we've got. Now, I'm assuming this will drive. I think it was.
Is it turned on?
Try it again. It was, but there we go. I think we've done acknowledgement. So just a quick overview of the agenda. I'll undertake a quick introduction, obviously what we're speaking about, also talk a little bit about the regional planning process that's only undertaken by the state government and the planning department, and a bit of background overview and key considerations specific to Concordia, which Clint will come up and talk about, and then we'll discuss next steps. So it's a fairly short presentation. We're sort of keen to get into more of a discussion and take questions and see what the feedback is like. But as we go through it, ask that maybe we can leave the questions towards till the end so that we can just cover the ground. We will, like I say, not spend too much time, but it's just important that way we've got all the points that you may be asking about early on that will probably come a little bit later in the presentation. So first of all, you're probably aware the Premier's announcement, it's probably a good 6-8 weeks ago now, in terms of land supply. The Premier announced Concordia, Dry Creek, Hackham and Sellex, and over 23,000 new homes planned as part of a release to get more land obviously on the market, and particularly in an environment, as we all know, with affordability concerns. It was a large announcement, and it recognised that to undertake this land supply and these sales effectively, there is a requirement to consider upfront infrastructure, which is a lot of what we will talk about tonight. And so he announced the creation of the Housing Infrastructure Planning and Development Unit as part of that announcement. That is the unit that I am currently acting director of and running, and Clint is joining me, and that we are establishing. Our remit is essentially to put the unit together and get it up and running as an ongoing entity, but also get things happening immediately at the same time. So we're kind of building it as we do it. The key sort of, you might say, core or goal of that group, as its sort of name suggests, is to properly plan and infrastructure up front to new growth areas. It's a little bit of learning from the past for the state government. We know there are areas in the past that have been developed, and I don't need to name some of them that come up in the media regularly that are arguably running a bit behind on infrastructure. It hasn't caught up, it hasn't kept up with growth, and it's had impacts on surrounding townships or the existing one itself or other areas. And of course, that reduces some of the, arguably, the livability of those areas. And so the goal here is to shore up infrastructure up front. And we're talking everything from roads, health, education, obviously power, water, all the usual suspects that you'd expect will be part of that process. That kind of falls within what you might understand the code amendment process or the rezoning process that already exists within the Planning Land Use Services Department, or part of our department, which is PLUS. That process of doing a rezoning includes an element of this upfront, but this new group strengthens that upfront infrastructure requirement, assessment and planning. And that leads us into essentially the infrastructure agreements process, which is the part where we deal with not just the entities and agencies and utilities, et cetera, that provide infrastructure, but the developers, and looking at how we go about delivering the infrastructure that we might all agree is required. So those infrastructure agreements of what has often been seen in other developments like deeds, and where developer might pay for intersection upgrades or different things, etc. We are looking at different ways of managing that process as well, and that forms part of this overall sort of group that we're putting together. So a bit of sort of broader context. In my sort of regular role, you might say, prior to being seconded to this acting position of getting this group going, I look after the growth management area within PLUS, which looks after all regional plans for the state, which is the 30-year plans that we are currently in the process of putting together, which replaces the current 30-year plan for Greater Adelaide, but also statewide. And I also look after the code amendment team and the team that looks after all population data. And I guess what we're looking at here is just explaining how that work done by the State Planning Agency links in, and the work that is being completed now to do those new updated plans for the next 30 years tie into not just Concordia growth area, but all growth areas and what will be going forward. So there is a broader view of the North more generally. We look at other areas in context, such as the Roseworthies, Gawler East, Riverlea, etc. So we are looking at Concordia specifically when it comes to infrastructure, but we're also looking at the context of the northern area more broadly and what that means and how we effectively deliver infrastructure to ensure that any growth and population growth is met with the appropriate level of infrastructure that is required. Concordia is obviously not a new area. It was raised in the 2010 30-year plan and has been deferred urban for some time, and therefore a lot of water has gone under the bridge in that time, but is now reaching the pointy end where, obviously, with the Premier announcing it, creating our unit, we are sort of really taking it as a priority and getting to work on what needs to be done to get it to market. So essentially, we can talk more about the context if anyone wants to know about it and the regional plans, but it was more about how we got here and also how it links in. Background overview, in terms of the last decade, obviously a lot has occurred already, and there are some details in this in a bit of a timeline. I'm going to hand over to Clint with this one, who'll go through in a bit more detail of what's occurred since that early deferred urban. Thanks, Paul.
So on the left-hand side there, it's got a very high-level view of what's happened really since 2010 and informing that strategic plan in 2010. So there was a whole range of work done around land supply in Adelaide. So one of the key recommendations of that was to release certain areas for future growth and identify the 30-year plan. So 2010, 2017 30-year plan for Greater Adelaide Concordia growth area has been identified for growth. In 2017, the major landowner there did significant amount of master plan works and investigations to look into the site and what the opportunities were. In 2021, that same landowner prepared a proposal to initiate. As I go through this presentation, there's a few pieces of terminology that I'll try and explain as well. Essentially, a proposal to initiate under the new PI Act is when somebody puts in an application to Plus and the Minister to start a code amendment process. So there needs to be a certain level of investigations done for the Minister to consider initiating it. Once they've initiated it, then they start the actual code amendment process. The Commission at the time, in 2022, made a decision that rather than it being a proponent-led code amendment, that it should be a CE, a Chief Executive of the Department of Trade and Investment led code amendment. And the reason for that was because of the significant scale, because the rezoning area for investigation shouldn't just be the area owned by that major landowner, but should be the entire Concordia growth area. And that all infrastructure, state government, like government investment, any other investment that's needed needs to be considered as a whole rather than just for land owned by, that particular developer. Then we fast forward to we come to 2022, late part of 2022, where the government project team was set up for Concordia growth area itself. So that government project group involves members of both the councils, so Barossa and Gawler, and it also has Infrastructure South Australia and DIT as members. That government project team was set up really to get the project started, to kickstart it. And it's been extremely useful over the last couple of months in us scoping this project up and looking at what's required. So in 2023, as Paul mentioned before, the Housing Infrastructure Planning and Development Unit was established. And really, we are able to now take what is identified as a strategic parcel from that strategic level identification, do all the investigations required and the land use planning changes for it then to come to the market and develop it and to deliver it. Some of those overview points are things that you probably already know. It's around 950 hectares. It's currently zoned rural. Almost 65% is under one landowner. And then the balance, there is some areas that's got a landowner, negotiations with developers and other that are just privately owned. There's a range of different sizes as well. So there's large scale rural down to very small sort of rural living allotments. Some of the initial investigations and land supply report for Adelaide identified, you're looking at around 10,000 dwellings, and that equates to around 20 to 25,000 residents. It would be about the same amount of time in terms of 25 years to develop it once it's started, and it could be longer just depending on sales rates. To give you a sense of scale, and not particularly to relate it to the type of development, but Mawson Lakes was around the 4,500 dwelling mark. So it's a significant project. That comes to that second to last point, that given the size of it and given the population, it will absolutely need its own town centre. It will need schools, it will need healthcare, early learning, aged care, and a whole range of other services to service a community that size. And I'll go into the importance of integration on the next slide as well with the Gawler Township. Another key point that the Premier made as well was around affordable housing, but that also comes through a mixture of housing types. So you'd find that there would be a whole range of housing types within the project, including that affordable housing. This slide here will go through some key considerations. This isn't a catch-all in terms of what we're looking at, but I thought for tonight it was worth talking about essentially our scope of works at a fairly high level. And this first dot point comes to mind before around appropriate integration with surrounding services, infrastructure and communities. You can see on the right-hand side, and let's see if my pointer works here. There we go. Wow. This is the site here. So that's the roughly 950 hectares, and the Gawler Main Street is just there. And then we've got Hewitt and other suburbs of Gawler. Springwood runs down through here. So, you know, the scale of the project is significant, and we'll need to consider infrastructure and community integration. Example of that would be traffic. So we already know that there is significant pressure in Gawler. This project will have to do very, very detailed traffic investigations to look at what the impacts of this new project will be on that, and also what other major transport networks are required to support the project and ensure that there's not, you know, inappropriate pressure put on this township of Gawler. Another example of that would probably be healthcare in terms of integration, given that there's a hospital in Gawler, given, you know, this project's broader region, broader role in the region as well. You know, what's the need for healthcare and how does that work with existing services within Gawler and surrounds? When we get to trunk infrastructure, really that is about where the existing things like water, sewer, electrical, etc. are, and what's required to bring it from where it is to the edge of the development so that the developer can tap into it. And that's where that gets built into infrastructure agreements, because it can be quite costly to close that gap. Preservation, conservation of key identified ecological vegetation habitats. As I said, in 2027, there was some work done that identified some significant areas down through the creek line here and also scattered through the site. So we need to build that into our thinking. Stormwater management, flood mitigation, obviously down through the Gawler River. There's currently some challenges, significant challenges, and building development upstream of that. We'll need to consider that. Broad major road connectivity, I mentioned before, and also opportunity for public transport, so buses, but also given that there's a train station in Gawler and that there's an existing line running sort of to the south of the site itself, what the opportunity is to extend that public transport network. Healthcare education, we look at location, capacity, timing and funding. And also then there's the policy planning element that supports that housing diversity and importantly encourages a high quality of design. In terms of process and next steps, this is again a fairly high level snapshot of what we're proposing or what we're going to undertake. We're at the moment in this pre-initiation phase. You can see the little "we are here" thing there. So again, very much at the start. We've established a government working group. There's been initial studies done on the site that may need some update work. And we need to undertake some high level infrastructure kind of identification, costing and trigger work. We prepare a draft structure plan, and then we look to prepare two pieces of documentation, I guess, that go to the minister. The first one is the proposal to initiate, which I mentioned before, which basically sets out what we're proposing to do, you know, how we foresee the site being rezoned, the investigations that have been done to date, and importantly, what additional investigations are needed when or if the minister initiates that code amendment. And then the other bit is infrastructure schemes or agreements. In the Act, there's the ability to undertake schemes within designated growth areas. While that hasn't been tested in a lot, or while that hasn't been implemented yet, it's something that we'd like to look at for this project because it overcomes a whole range of challenges that we know exist with deeds at the moment when they're over multiple landowners. So through that pre-initiation phase, you know, here tonight, this is really the start of it. So there'll be multiple sessions like this, I imagine, with council. We're planning on a landowner information session. So landowners should get letters in their letterbox over the next month, we hope. And we'll have a similar session to this for landowners. And then if that documentation goes to the minister considers it. If it gets initiated, we go to the next phase. And the next phase is when we work at that next level of detail. And that's when the very serious consultation begins. We look at very detailed investigations. We look at designs for some things that require upfront investment. And we engage heavily with council, with the community, landowners. And when I say other stakeholders, it'll be agencies, it will be a whole range of other people that are required to input into the project. At that stage as well, we look to prepare the scheme. which sets out the infrastructure requirements, cost triggers, responsibility, things like that. And then once all that information is put together, the whole package goes to the minister to consider for approval. We'd like to run infrastructure and policy planning at the same time. In reality, you know, they might kind of go like this a little bit, but ultimately the minister will be considering infrastructure provision and the code amendment. I think that is the last slide.
Questions, members? Councillor Kosh and then Councillor Davies.
Yeah, thanks, Mayor. You've got a couple of questions. So this sounds like a new process. So what's the strategy of actually making sure that the infrastructure is put in place? For example, timing and costings. From my experience, developers have been a little bit hesitant when it comes to doing things, and sometimes they renege on things unless you've got an infrastructure deed. Sometimes even when you've got one, they wiggle around a bit. So what's your strategy to actually make sure that the developers actually put the infrastructure in a timely way?
Yeah, thanks for the question. You're right, this is a little bit new in that we're looking at utilising infrastructure schemes, and they're very different to deeds. So deeds don't necessarily have the flexibility to negotiate as time goes by. The difference too with an infrastructure scheme is that it's administered by the minister, whereas an infrastructure deed is administered by the signatories of the deed. So, you know, in terms of accountability, it's much more difficult to achieve that, which I think speaks to your point. And also you can structure infrastructure deeds, you know, to be quite bespoke to the project themselves, whereas deeds are a little bit more limited in terms of, you know, what they can achieve.
I've got a question. You talked about the train line, and we know the train line goes out to the Barossa. If they extend the train line and if there's half-hour trains, that would mean Murray Street would be stopped every half an hour, because that's usually what what trains are, every half an hour. So Murray Street would be gridlocked every half an hour during the day, and maybe on weekends. So how will you manage that?
Oh, look, that's a fair question, but it's obviously fairly detailed given where we're at. To be fair, even considering the extension of the rail line and what that might entail, what it might look like, what it might mean, there'd be a whole lot of work that needs to be done to even determine that first. And of course, as part of that would be the assessment of all level crossings, how they're operated, and also what level crossings are required or not required, etc. In terms of the infrastructure planning, we're talking a long-term 25-year build time. So whilst we look at all these things up front, there's a lot of work still to be done to consider that. So to be honest, that sort of level of detail we don't have the answer to. It's similar to saying how much traffic's going to be on the road, what's going to be on the Barossa Valley Way, how will Main Street, Gawler fare. There'll be all that work done in terms of the transport analysis, and the train line will be part of that analysis. So I guess that's what we're trying to highlight is it could be part of the puzzle. There's no decision that it definitely is, but it seems like a logical thing to obviously look at. But there's a whole lot of work to be done before we can answer that detailed question. But it's a fair point.
It is a fair point, and it's something that is raised with me on many, many occasions. And there's a lot of traffic that goes through Murray Street. So I'm just highlighting to
No, that's
you
fine. I get that.
that could be a major problem.
Yes, no, and I agree. I've spent over 20 years in the transport department, and we've studied Gawler a lot. We know the traffic movements. We understand the local movements versus the through movements, the pressure from the Barossa, areas like this that create. That's why we're highlighting the need for public transport to help relieve the pressure. But there's obviously other factors of that, where it crosses roads, what it does. So all of it is in the mix to be, analysed, and it's one of the key areas. Transport infrastructure will be one of the biggest components of our assessment process.
I'll go to Councillor Davies now. I think it is him.
Yeah, I mean, well, I was going to ask about the trains, but I guess also talking about if we don't get a train line extension, that's also something that could be an issue in terms of the amount of where the end of the train line, commuters driving into the station and commuting from there, traffic, car parking spaces and all that kind of thing.
Yeah.
So
Correct.
Just sort of highlighting that as well.
Yeah, no, I agree. Because even if you said you're going to have a park and ride or something in Gawler, you know, how do people get to it? How do they operate it? So absolutely, all of this will be in the mix for the transport analysis, which will be, as I say, a massive component of this. We are well aware of the potential impact on, you know, Gawler proper, where we're standing now. If it isn't done correctly, the intention is obviously to try and do it correctly so that we don't do that. And it, like I say, will be a massive component to go through, but all of those factors will be considered as part of that process.
Councillor Hughes.
Just on the approval process, like if there's not a link to the Sturt Highway or a link through Schomburg Drive down to Tibber Road or something like that, is that enough to actually stop the development happening? Because otherwise, the traffic issues for Gawler will be horrendous.
Yeah, look, given the scale of this, exactly, it's a huge development. It's not, you know, we're not talking 1,000 homes even, we're talking a massive number. So that is appreciated that there'll need to be considerable investment in transport infrastructure and how that's managed. And again, that'll come back to the network modelling and where we think the movements are going to be. Where are people with their living in Concordia? Where are they working? Where are they going? Is their shopping going to be done within the area of Concordia? Are they working in the Barossa? Are they travelling out to the Sturt Highway? All of those assumptions, tests, scenarios will be done as part of the transport planning. I know that's the sort of thing I've done for many years. To work out exactly what is required to manage the level of traffic that's anticipated and expected from the development, of which, as you say, there will be a lot. So the short answer will be there will need to be major investment, yes, to cater for this level. We can't just throw 10,000 houses out there and expect it all to just seep into the network. We're well aware of that.
Have you had any conversations with SA Health and the local health network?
We are starting the conversations with all government agencies, so they are, yes, part of it. Our unit's only been in formation for literally 2 to 3 weeks, but we are going through all the agencies. So yeah, health, education, transport, all of it, utilities, SA Water, SAPN, all of it will form part of the conversations for the infrastructure.
Because health, people assume that they're going to get access to health, and that's a basic right in Australia. And that's another thing that's raised with me quite regularly. I'll go back to Councillor Hughes. I think you had a question, Councillor Hughes.
It was more or less probably an understanding that I think if that road network, especially the Sturt Highway and through the back through Tibber Road, isn't established, I think it's not going to work. But the cost to actually get it to the Sturt Highway over the North Para or through the back of Gawler is huge costs just to get that traffic in. It's just massive cost.
Is correct? It's not, again, as you all appreciate, this is not a small development that we're talking about, and that's why we're doing a lot of stuff early. That's why we're here to talk about it early, to work through this, why this is touch point one of many that we'll be having, both not only with council but public landowners, because there is a lot to work through and there'll be a lot of investment required and there'll be a lot that's needed to make the development work. We are talking about something that is essentially double in terms of Gawler will double in size.
We're
look at the
aware
area.
of that. We're
Yeah,
completely aware of that.
and that's exactly why we're not treating it lightly. We wouldn't be here. We wouldn't have an infrastructure unit if it wasn't for that being taken seriously, because the appreciation of exactly what this entails, it's not something small. So yeah, I agree. It's going to be a large investment, and that is going to be challenging in terms of how it's funded and what it means for developers versus state funding, all the rest of it. But again, that's part of the challenge that we need to take on. But we're in the early days. We're kicking it off.
Has there been discussions with federal government around funding?
It's a little bit early for talking about funding, yeah, to be honest, of where it will come from. And all that will come out. The first step really is understanding the infrastructure itself, what's going to be required before we talk about the levels of funding and where it will come from. But that, again, that'll be part of the process that we'll work through pragmatically and logically as we go through to understand the level, the scale, and then how it will be funded.
Because I've been told that the pressure on Lindott Road, as people come down Lindott Road, if they don't use Schomburg Drive and Molamar Way, they will go down Lindott Road and that will be gridlocked. So that's quite a concern for people in Gawler.
Yep.
Quite a concern. Councillor Hennessy, did you have your hand up? No, I saw your hand up first. Yeah.
Okay, thank you. I'm just reinforcing that I'm sure working in transport, you're aware of it. We actually need the bypass right now. I've got family in the north bringing farming vehicles through with live animals. They don't want to come through the main street of Gawler. It's dangerous. So I actually think that should be a trigger that without the bypass road, this cannot proceed because and to use your words, it's going to provide inappropriate pressure on Gawler. It will kill the town.
Yep.
So for me, it's a starter and a finisher. Without that bypass, sorry.
Excuse me. And that's one of the things that we are, as I say, up front, is front of mind to us. This is not, again, a separate development out on its own somewhere where you can just consider what impacts it might have on a road. It has an impact on a current community, an existing community that's been here a long time, that has a certain level of livability that we appreciate. And that whilst there is advantages to growth in terms of economic development and jobs for those that do live here, you don't want that undermined or overtaken by, sort of an increasing pressure on already struggling and at capacity infrastructure, which we're aware of. And transport is something that I'm well aware has not exactly been fluid and easy for a long time. And the Gawler Main Street has been relied upon probably for through movements that it shouldn't. It's a destination. It's more of a local place type movement, and appreciate that. Those contexts or that context will need to underpin the work that we're doing on Concordia to ensure that anyone who is coming into Gawler is doing it for the right reasons, going to the shops that you probably want them to go to, but isn't just travelling through it for the sake of getting from Concordia to the city, for example. And that comes back to connections, appropriate connections to maybe the Cert Highway or how it goes around and how it links in together with when you wrap around the back of Concordia, you're not actually that far from employment lands and Roseworthy either. So there's a whole, again, that comes back to that comment I made about the northern area more generally and understanding the infrastructure requirements for the north around Gawler and the Barossa, because the Barossa is in a character preservation district where it doesn't have a lot of opportunity to grow the Barossa townships because of the zoning of character preservation is a preservation of the land there. You can't do mass scale residential development on that land. So there will be a feeder effect, we expect, from the likes of Concordia and areas outside of the Barossa where people will be employed in the Barossa but living somewhere else. Now, there is advantages to that they shop where they live and do other things. So that's not a bad thing economically. But what does it mean for movement and at all times a day? That's what we'll be looking at. So yeah, it's certainly not underappreciated, the comments that you're making. Some of the details, apologies, we're not near that. Obviously, there's a lot of work to be done, but they are certainly in our minds.
So there were some studies done looking at the impact when Concordia was announced on Potts Road, and that was all done in relation to the Gawler East Link Road. And it was made quite clear in one of those reports that that intersection would not cope. And so that work, there has been some work done. Yep. Now, I'm sure that you'll do more detailed work. I'm expecting you to do more detailed work, and the people of Gawler are expecting you to do more detailed work because Helen's right. The impact of this development on Gawler is going to be profound. Are you
you're referring to the work that was done back in 2010? Is that yeah. So that all the work,
that was modelling work.
Yeah, it was
certainly.
I remember it. I know who did it. So that sort of work, a lot of it was, as you say, effective at the time, and certain interventions were put in to cater for what was happening at the time. But it's well recognised that what has been put in place may or may not, I think we probably all know the answer, cater for what's coming in the future. So there'll be a whole lot of work around that. Again, all that analysis will be built upon to understand what the impact of this is.
It'd be really good if collector roads, state government roads, etc., are classed as state government roads, so that the state actually manages the roads rather than pushing them onto local government, because that kills local government, particularly with bridges, etc. So I would urge you to assess roads accordingly and appropriately so that they're not pushed onto local government, and it might just tip the edge of the sustainability of a local government. Deputy Mayor.
Firstly, thanks for coming out. I think it's handy to have these initial conversations. Obviously, it's a tough topic to drive into, and you're going to set up a very historic time that we're in right now of what we're going to set up for the next 25 years. Just on the previous slide, you actually had a step-by-step to get to the code amendment to the minister. Can you just outline a bit of a timeline around that? You know, is it going to take 3 years? Is it going to take 12 months?
Do you want to talk about that?
Yeah. It's a very, very, very difficult one to answer. It is absolutely a state government priority to make sure there's enough land on the market for the growth in Adelaide, across Adelaide, and that there's the housing diversity and affordability. That being said, we've also got, like, obviously you can see those processes that we need to follow, and there's certain steps that we need to take. So all I can say is that at this stage, we know that code amendments processes can be as quick as 6 months, and they can be as long as years. The infrastructure, the actual proposal to initiate early initial infrastructure investigations can take, you know, again, they can take sort of 6 to 12 months or something like that, and even longer, just depending on, you know, what the minister's requirements are. So I know that it's not a very good question. It's a very vague question, but it might be somewhere in between what you were suggesting. And then if things get extremely complex or the negotiations difficult or funding difficult, stuff like that, things can also take longer. So we will hopefully be able to refine that thinking as we progress, and as we know more about the complexity of the project. You can kind of start to tick off, you know, those kind of, where you start to tick off the kind of high risk things and say, okay, cool, work that out, and that can refine our timeframes.
So Councillor Kosh, Councillor Hughes, you had a question, you had your hand up, and then Councillor Kosh.
Thanks, Mayor. Yeah, just about, it was mentioned about the character of the Barossa being villages, and even through the Adelaide Plains, Roseworthy, even Gawler for a while was that village. Is that sort of something overarching in the master plan process that you're looking at as well? So that's going to
I can say a few words on that. So really the master plan at this stage is looking at what is the critical infrastructure, what's the timing required, what's the funding mechanisms, how the agreements look, right, who is responsible, and then the code amendment part is the policy to support good urban development. Master planning around character and things like that can also happen at a master plan stage, kind of a next level stage, but we can also do some initial high level visioning as the stages that we're undertaking as well. But you certainly wouldn't be down to like streetscape design, you know, housing kind of design guidelines or anything like that as part of the phases that I showed you earlier. Yeah.
Councillor Kosh.
So can I add just something quick on that? Sorry about regional plans. When you touch on the zoning, that regional plan process we talk about over the next 15 to 30 years is looking at zonings and what they currently are and what they maybe should be in the future. Character preservation at this point in time is being retained as it is to protect the Barossa and the region. There is the EFPA, which is the Environmental Food Production Area as well, which obviously protects productive land. That is also, we try and make a no-touch, like hill space, those kind of zones. The current intention is to try and retain those zones and work within the bounds that we have, not quite the old urban growth boundary, but we're talking about boundaries sort of within what we've already sort of had in deferred urban. Now, there is challenges around that for future, because sort of touching on where you're sort of, I think, heading in terms of where people are going to go if the Barossa remains like it is, but still economically grows. How do people live around it? That's where we have to start looking where do you go next? Okay, and so over a 30-year period, okay, if Concordia takes 15 to 20 years and we know it's serving a certain land supply, but we need more, and you've got Roseworthy, all the rest, but there will continue to be growth, there'll continue to be demand. That 30-year planning process is going through that itself. Gawler falls within the 30-year plan for Greater Adelaide, and that process is underway now, and consultation will be working over the next 12 months to come up with a new plan late next year. So that's another touch point, you might say, that the state government will be having locally with community engagement to work through that process to get feedback on where does everyone who lives locally to these areas think that people should be going? Where should, you know, okay, Concordia has been earmarked over a decade ago, but when the next area comes up, whatever that might be for the next 30 years, that, you know, the next generation is going to live with, what do we think that should be? That is another process that's going in parallel with us. So we're more on the detailed side, but that is happening as well. And it's worth just, I guess, knowing that's coming, because that'll be another really important process for both council and the community to be involved in to help shape the region in the future.
Councillor Kosh.
Yeah, thanks. You said you'll be talking to different entities about what is needed out there. So who will you be actually talking to? Is it just the developers and the council, or as a starting point, I suppose?
Yeah, so in terms of the infrastructure requirements?
Yes.
Yeah, so it's all government agencies. So our role is to coordinate and sit in the middle of all agencies of government, and then also, yes, with landowners / developers and local government.
So whichever local government is, whatever boundary
Correct.
is, you'll be talking to those councils
Correct.
about that infrastructure needs.
Yes.
Now, the other question I've got is, you talked about the code amendment stage when it goes to the minister, and you're talking about infrastructure design costs and triggers. What happens if you get to a point where you can't get the developers to actually agree to the design, the cost and the triggers? For example, they might want to put the bypass in 25 years, not in 10 years, or they don't want to pay for it. You've got to get over the North Parrot. What happens then is that, to me, when I look at this, it looks like it's a fait accompli, but I don't know whether it is or not, whether you get to a point where the minister say, well, no, the infrastructure isn't going to be there, it's just not going to work, we're going to walk away from it.
Well, I think that comes back to the ministers. The minister obviously makes the decision on a code amendment to effectively at the end of it rezone. The minister has made it very clear that he's not keen to do that unless infrastructure is catered for in the appropriate level, which means the appropriate level that is what's considered acceptable for those that end up managing it. So transport needs to wants to manage it. Council needs to manage what's left when it's local, social, or road infrastructure, etc. SA Water. So there needs to be agreement from those agencies. That's part of the process. And the minister can make the decision on whether to approve a rezone or not on the basis of whether he's comfortable that he's received that. I'm not obviously here to speak for the minister, but the reason that we've got this group and what we're doing from himself and the Premier is because they want to get that right. So the intention would be that unless it is worked through properly, that a rezoning shouldn't occur. Now, you're right, that's not an easy task. That's why we're dedicated to doing it. That's why a group's been created to spend all this time doing it, because it's not easy. And it hasn't always been done well in the past. State government hasn't always done it well. It hasn't always worked. What can we do differently? That's where we're experimenting with different approaches like infrastructure schemes, which give a bit more flexibility, more fairness on how what kind of level of funding or provision is given by each entity and each group. But also there's a step back of looking at the state itself and asking the question of how much should the state fund if it wants the economic growth too. Because sometimes developers can't be expected to fund a $1 billion road, but maybe the state looks at that as well. So there's a whole lot of layers to it. So yes, it's not easy. And when we certainly don't think it's easy. There are mechanisms to prevent a rezoning occurring if the minister's not comfortable that it has been done. And so that's really the measure for it, is that if we want the growth, if the developer wants to build, then it has to be done. There has to be an answer. We have to find a way to get an agreement, or else it's difficult to progress.
So I know that you know the history around code amendments, the ministerial Springwood Code Amendment and the Mount Barker Code Amendment in 2010, and no infrastructure deeds were put in place. Here it was a 1,000 lot trigger, and then you get a road, and that was it. That was it.
Yep.
And that was the same up at Mount Barker, and I don't think they've still got their road.
No, the link road's not completed at Mount
So
Barker.
it was poorly done. So we have a community that has had that experience, and I'm pleased to hear that you're putting things, you're at least attempting to get infrastructure in place before the people come.
Yep.
Which I think is encouraging. However, there really needs to be an understanding of the impact of Gawler as well.
Oh, absolutely. And that's why I say it's not even Mount Barker, and obviously correct, that was one of the ones I was, not very loosely alluding to, that we all know about, of what has occurred out there. That's a poster for us in terms of what we need to ensure it isn't repeated in that sense. Not all of Mount Barker was poorly done, but there is a lot of gaps in there, as we well know. We are looking at that project separately. But the intention of this group is to not repeat the things that didn't go well, and have that catch-up infrastructure approach where it's, let the people come and then the infrastructure will catch up. We know that's not effective. It's not effective in a spot like Mount Barker where it was a new area attached to a freeway already, you might say. We've got a new area here, not just attached to a freeway, but attached to an existing township that has an expectation and a fair expectation to still be able to live and have a life that you had prior to this coming in. It should complement it, not overrun it. So that is in our mind in terms of how do we learn from some of those mistakes, but also the different context that we've got here, as you mentioned, that it's not as simple as just a greenfield out there connecting to a freeway either. So it is a complex one, but again, that's why we're here starting to talk about it and getting feedback early, and that's why we've got a group to look at it, or else it wouldn't happen.
Thank you very much, Councillor Hennessy.
Thank you, Mayor. And it's perhaps we can just look at this as some of the opportunities, because like Mount Barker, we are desperately in need of a greenfield development on our hospital system. It's not something that can, like Mount Barker, try to be continually developed. Our hospital now is too small, very enclosed, and it needs a whole new thing. It'll take 10 years to probably plan towards it. So maybe with a link road in there, there's an opportunity to do a greenfield development of a new hospital that would serve all of this area, including the Barossa.
I agree with that. We actually need a new hospital. Hospitals can find, in their wisdom, SA Health sold the land around the hospital, which probably in retrospect, always easy in retrospect, when you make these decisions, but yeah, it won't cope. Now, I know the hospital's doing a master plan, and I know that they're looking at specialist centres and allied health centres and nursing-led clinics and all of those innovative models, which is fantastic. So I would urge you to talk with SA Health or the local health network, Rebecca Graham in particular. And I think that it would be useful to forward plan, as Councillor Hennessy says. Now, I'm going to go across to our CEO. You'd like to ask a few questions?
Yeah, thank you, Karen. Just a couple of questions. So what I'm hearing is that the department will be looking at Concordia from a whole of Gawler perspective, and will be considering all the many diverse impacts from a whole of population perspective, i.e. a 40 or 50,000 population community. Is that correct? So it's not just the immediate site, not just the immediate perimeter, but it's the whole of Gawler impact.
Yeah, it's exactly the impact on the existing, you'll call it township or area and surrounding areas. What that looks like, I can't tell you what it'll look like yet, but yes, the intention is to obviously understand the impacts on the surrounding area, because they are anticipated to be fairly, obviously, potentially significant if it's not done right.
And that's not only in terms of physical infrastructure, but also community infrastructure.
Correct.
In terms of the studies to be undertaken and who funds the studies, but the independence of those studies, can you just provide us some clarity in terms of commissioning of studies and ensuring independence?
So once we get into the next phase, we go out to market for consultants, and we put together scopes in terms of scope of works. So it's the government going out and seeking a consultant, not the landowners themselves. It's us as the project managers. Essentially, our chief executive is going out as the person running the code amendment.
Thank you. And just one last question. Where, and well, not when or where, but when the studies identified that the doubling of the population of Gawler will have a material impact on an existing community in a physical sense and a structural sense and a planning sense and a community sense. And if those investigations identify that there needs to be investment outside of the boundaries of the development and not and outside and further beyond the perimeter of the development, in the heart of Gawler, open space, stormwater and such like, is that something that the department is looking at, and will have conversations with the developer to ensure that when the population of Gawler is doubled and there are impacts within the existing community, that that there is a contribution regime in place in that regard.
I think we might need to make a distinction between planning for Concordia growth area and all of Gawler. So, because when we talk about social infrastructural planning and stuff like that, we're not looking at planning for the upgrade of a local park 500 metres or 2 kilometres down the road or something like that. We're looking at the large scale infrastructure that will service the entire community. So I think we will have to draw a line in the sand between local infrastructure and things that service the region and that are impacted by the Concordia growth area project themselves.
So you talked previously about complementing Gawler. So when you talk about the word complement, it's complement. So you don't duplicate, you actually complement. So will that occur?
I think we've got to work on that with you guys. That's something that we have to.
Because if you duplicate, that's dumb. With all due respect, you know, you when you complement,
right.
you share resources.
That's right. So if we look at regional open space, for example, that would be something that would be looked at a broader scale. If we look at local parks, that's obviously servicing the very direct local community. So that's more about the project or the suburb itself. So when we talk about, we're going to be very specific around regional infrastructure, right? And things that service the broader community or the broader region.
That's what I mean by the word complement, because if you duplicate, that doesn't make a lot of sense to me.
Yeah, and there will, exactly right. So
and I think that's where Henry's coming from.
Yeah.
The impact to Gawler and the impact on services, etc., stormwater, roads, all of that, and other facilities. If you complement, it actually works better.
Yeah.
But you're saying that. I think I heard this right. Correct me if I'm wrong. That you'll be working on Concordia and all the development that is required there, but not necessarily the impact it has on Gawler.
No, we'll be looking at the impacts again in terms of the impacts that it has on Gawler.
And who pays for the impacts?
That's what
of Gawler.
That's what we have to work out through the infrastructure agreement process.
Right.
Okay. So there'll be a raft of investigations, and what will pop out of that is okay, what is the infrastructure required to support this community, and then integrate with the existing community in the appropriate way. And then we come back and we discuss those matters in terms of what does the detail of that look like.
Right.
Yeah.
Okay. So who pays?
That's what'll be part of that next phase.
I understand that, but often it's the local council that pays. Because that's been our history. That's been our history.
We don't have those details.
All right. Well, I know that you're going to do a great job. I'll go to Deputy Mayor now.
Thank you, Mayor. I think that was a good segue for my question. Sometimes we can get stuck on the population growth and being an impost, and then sometimes we can forget about the economic benefit. You did touch on it earlier, but I guess what I'd hate to see happen is the adverse and the town of Gawler be left behind and it be a ring rooted around. So how are we going to talk about the potential in, and I think it was touched on before as well, but avoiding that double up and seeing what businesses we provide in the town of Gawler that services the region now that those businesses benefit from. We don't want to see those businesses suffer because all of a sudden their business is now stolen across the border, so to speak. And I think the infrastructure that we're talking about, regional, again, correct me if I'm wrong, what I'm picking up from what you're saying is, yes, maybe not a local park, but when we talk about public transport, that infrastructure upgrade will have to happen locally in the town of Gawler to ensure that that infrastructure works well with the new development. You're saying nodding, so I'll take that. And then also we're trying to, I guess, position ourselves strategically to be able to support that sports and rec need for the region. The CEO did touch on it well, I think, about that social infrastructure side. So we would hate to see a competing sporting precinct be delivered by a developer that actually would be a competitive model. That said, another 25,000 would support those sorts of infrastructure needs, but it's about the balance, I guess, on making sure that our targets and the KPIs we're working towards aren't, you know, taken away, and we can mutually benefit from the population growth as well. So I was just wondering when the triggers would come into play when those sorts of conversations are happening. Like, yeah.
And look, I think you've touched on a really good point in terms of the planning process around this and the infrastructure provision, that we have to step back and look at it as, yes, there's X number of more people coming in, but it's an entire, again, this comes back to that regional view of how many people are going to live up here. And of course, all the agencies, education has its trigger points for how many people you have before you trigger a new school. Health has its provision, you know, how many people do you need before you trigger new GP surgeries versus a hospital upgrade or a second hospital, or how do you make that work more effectively? Is, for example, health might say, do we upgrade the existing hospital and buy their land back or whatever? Or do we build another facility that takes certain components of that elsewhere in the new development, all those kind of things. And schools are very similar. You know, what's the capacity left in current schools? I don't personally know, maybe high, maybe nothing. What does that mean? All of that's in the unique sort of setup that we have here in terms of an existing population next to a new one, that can only be done together as looking at one populace and what that means. And if you say, okay, there's 50,000 people, what does that mean? Do you physically need, and what do you already have? And therefore what needs to be provided? And does it get provided on that new site out there, at Concordia, or is it upgrades to existing sites in Gawler that are appropriate for an upgrade that can cater for both? Those kind of questions, which I think sort of ties into what you're answering. And I think it is important not to lose sight of that population growth is not always a bad thing. I think that is a good point, because the economic growth, the jobs and what comes with it can be very positive if it is done right and if it is done well. The concern in the past is it hasn't always been done well. There's an opportunity here to do it better and have that gain. And that's where businesses grow. As we know, it's jobs for the, you know, kids don't have to leave to get the jobs, they can stay. Those kind of big picture demographic questions are sort of helpful to answer when you look at it in that context. So that is the intention, to look at it that way. And that's why we're pulling in all state government agencies who do this long-term planning work themselves for their own space. We tap into each one of them to work out what they're doing, what they're looking at, and try and get the answers from that process.
So have you done any modelling on jobs?
Not yet.
Not
We're just started off. I mean, there'll be that's part of what you look at in terms of the process of the living, the working, and the understanding the demographics and the movements and everything down to network movements, traffic movements, all comes down to where they live, where they work, all that kind of stuff. So that is part of it. The specifics around job creation, etc. Look, again, we're more focused on infrastructure, but of course that there is that layer to it. Yes,
because there's infrastructure construction jobs, but they end. They're not permanent. They're, you know, you might have them over 10 or 15 years. But, you know, people actually want high paying jobs. They want permanent jobs. They don't want to travel long distances to get work. And here in the north, there hasn't been a lot of jobs. It's always been elsewhere that the jobs are. So it really is important to understand where the jobs will be and whether people will be travelling to those jobs. They probably won't take the train, because the train takes you into the city and then you've got to get out and go somewhere else. And so you've got to catch either 2 trains, 2 buses, 1 train, etc. Takes 2 hours to get anywhere. So most people will take their cars.
yes, and yeah.
Most people will take their cars when you live out here. I really think there needs to be some really important work done on jobs and bringing out manufacturing jobs, whatever, you know, advanced manufacturing jobs out here to actually allow people to not travel long distances in their cars, 2 hours there and 2 hours back. There needs to be the jobs here. So I'd really urge you to advocate. And I'm looking at David Reynolds here as the CE. It really is important. The North has been forgotten in South Australia, and it really is important that people have jobs out here. And it's not just health, it's not just education, it's other activities as well. It's not just the submarine corps and the nuclear as it was said on the radio today, nuclear jobs, it's advanced manufacturing. That's where, that's where people who may not want a tertiary education need to have meaningful work. And we haven't had that for a long time. So I'd really urge you to advocate, David, looking straight at you, to bring jobs here, because we're going to have 50,000 people in one community, and they'll all be sharing facilities, and there needs to be work here.
And
So
that's one advantage of a higher population is it often attracts jobs in companies because they know they've got a pool of people and talent to use. So there is that element to it.
Well, the majority of people in Adelaide live in the north. And I say that because Margaret Arstor, a very well-known cardiologist who works at the Lowell McEwen, has said that on many occasions, and that hasn't happened. So yes, we've got some manufacturing jobs in Edinburgh and Edinburgh Parks, fantastic, but we need more. The majority of people in Adelaide live in the north, and I think that there needs to be some really serious thought done. And I'm looking at Matt Worthall here, who's Federal Chief of Staff of Matt Burnell there. It really is important that jobs are placed in the north where people live. It's a no-brainer. It's a no-brainer.
And some of that does fall nicely within that regional planning process about where the employment zones and where the employment lands are and how that's laid. There's a lot of work being done on that. So even aside from the more specific infrastructure approach we're taking to a specific site and the broader area, when you look at employment lands and where the jobs are going to be, there are pieces of work being done in the planning department in that space. So I'd urge council to definitely take the regional planning process very seriously and get heavily involved. The department will be reaching out a lot, and it's an important thing because that sets the 15 to 30 year time frame, and that's where those kinds of changes can happen. The Edinburgh Parks, that doesn't happen overnight. I remember drawing roads in there 20 years ago. Those things take time. This is a 30-year plan. This is where you start to get that thing kicking off in line with something like a residential development like Concordia. So when that parallel process comes up, it's really important for council to be part of it.
I think it's not just up to council, it's up to everybody. Everybody who's in senior leadership positions needs to think about where people work.
Yeah,
and
we are.
I know Matt completely agrees with me, and there has never been enough work in the north, and it really is time for that to change. And we're all responsible, not just local government, and we'll get involved, absolutely. We'll get involved and we'll advocate really strongly for people to have local jobs and local well-paid jobs, because that means that people become financially sustainable when they have well-paid jobs. So I am harping on about it, but we haven't had the jobs in the north, and I think that's unfair. So I'll stop talking about that now. Councillor Davies.
Yeah, so I mean, I think from what you've been saying so far, everything sounds good. I guess it is over a long time though. You could have tens of ministers from between now and then. I'm just curious.
God forbid.
Yeah.
It's being recorded.
You could have multiple ministers in the next 20 years. I'm just curious, I guess, the degree to which what you're saying now will be enshrined in documents rather than just what you're saying now, but then, 12 years from now, a minister comes along and says, oh, I've got a better idea, Yeah.
Look, obviously all ministers have free choice to do certain things, but no, look, this is a process that's being undertaken, yes, with the minister and premier obviously driving the process, but we are a part of the public sector, and all the agencies that we're dealing with are all public sector, and we, having been in the public sector a very long time, the threads of the processes, and I used to do 20, 30 year strategic transport planning for the better part of a decade, that spanned multiple ministers, and you still keep the core and the position that you're taking within you sometimes change things around the edges, but at the end of the day, there is still a component of what remains because it's required. And to be fair on ministers, most do come in with an element of maybe what they want to add to something or change, but they also understand the need for stability. And so in the past, you do tend to get a level of stability as well. So I think we've got, I like to think we've got the risk covered.
So the MATS,
As best we
the
can.
MATS plan is still on the agenda.
Yeah, that's right. I've got the orange covered version sitting there and plans. Yeah, I've seen it many a time.
CEO, you wanted to ask a question?
Yeah, Paul,
Yep.
when you and your team are planning for Concordia and creating community and
Yep.
thinking about communities of interest, are you looking at it from the point of view of Concordia as part of the Gawler community or Concordia as part of the Barossa community?
Well, given its location, it is a bit of both, but I think physically it's part of, I think most would accept the Gawler community in terms of where it's placed, sitting almost on it. But I think it forms both, and it straddles, as we know, the way where it sits in terms of multiple council areas. So we see it as a regional impact. The question around exactly what that means, we haven't got yet. But we would expect that in many cases, given the size of Gawler and the type of facilities that are already here, the natural impact will be to go to Gawler to get what you need or what you do, not to go to the Barossa, as opposed to maybe some of the employment, at least early on, might be the other way, depending what it is. But I think that'll flesh out as we do the analysis, that everything from the transfer analysis, understanding the demographics, the movement, the employment patterns, I think will give a better picture of that. But it's obviously a regional impact. Something that size is not going to just benefit or impact one area. We talk about Gawler a lot, obviously, because we're in here tonight, but also because of its physical location, but it's going to have a broader regional impact.
I agree. I think that there will be quite a significant impact in the region. I think that impact will be positive. I think economic development will grow. However, I'll go back to jobs, but I'll go to Councillor Hennessy. I think you had your hand up.
Thank you, Mayor. No, sorry, maybe it's a little cynical, but we have the experience of 30 years ago when Hewitt was planned, and that was going to be a self-contained, non-influencing community adjacent to Gawler.
Yep.
I've worked here and I've had the experience of people coming in to complain about council into this office. They have very little connection back to, to some of their communities and the rest of life. They are part of Gawler. Concordia eventually will see themselves as part of Gawler.
Yeah.
We've been a regional town since we commenced 100 and whatever years it is ago. We've always provided services for the community, for the regional community. That is our purpose. And so we're very good at providing those services and encouraging those people to join into our community. So yeah, I just look forward with interest to seeing how the planning for that occurs. Thank you.
Yeah, fair call. And I think that does touch on some learnings from the past, like we talk about, and there's a number of examples where we know that in hindsight might have been done a little bit differently. This is a chance to do that.
Look, if there's no further questions, I'd like to thank all three of you for coming along. You've all been targeted at one point or another, and you've done exceptionally well. And I'm sure the people here who've come along tonight have appreciated the sharing of where you're up to, which is fairly well at the beginning. I know that you haven't got all the answers, and you've been very honest in explaining that you don't have all the answers just yet, but you've explained as well around your processes, which we thank you for. I would like, if I may be so bold, to have a repeat meeting at some point. We may discuss that, but I think that our community of Gawler and Concordia and the surrounding areas would really benefit from having another discussion, because I don't think they had enough time to really come along tonight. I know there's a Barossa on the 5th of April. I think that's at 5:30 p.m. at the council offices. However, I think that one here would be really useful. So we might discuss that. I'll go through Andrew, go through proper process, Andrew, yes, and see if we can have a repeat meeting. I think it might be useful for people to understand what's happening. But thank you for coming along, gentlemen. I know that you work very hard. I know that you're very passionate about what you're doing, and I know that you're very accomplished. So thank you for coming along. And we might, is there anything else you'd like to say at all?
No, look, but just again, thank you for the comments and welcoming us here. We do appreciate it. We appreciate the opportunity to have these early discussions. That's part of this process, is trying to have as many as we possibly can, because as we said, we do need and want the input to try and get it right. So no, thank you for the opportunity.
Thank you very much. So we might call this briefing to a close. Thank you everyone for coming along, and anyone who might be listening online. We're going into another briefing workshop very shortly. Thank you, everyone.